Have you ever had one of those moments in life where you're like, what have I been doing? This week that moment happened to me where I was like, how did I not look this up sooner? So, to rewind, about a couple of weeks ago I had a friend reach out that works at a hospital here in Cairns. Reached out and went, look, we're placing some contract nurses. We need to be able to put them in somewhere for 7 weeks. And they were offering an exorbitant amount basically per night. And I went to him, that's a crazy amount to offer per night for accommodation. That's well above the residential rates. How come? And he put it quite simply. He was like, look, $1,000 a week absolutely is a big amount for a permanent property. But for short term, have a look around and see what you can find under $150 per night. It basically doesn't exist. So that sent me down this rabbit hole of looking at Airbnb properties and looking at the short-term holiday let market and short-term rental market. And that's what brought me to arrive to this video today of comparing what do Airbnb returns look like when comparing them to traditional long-term rentals. So today I wanted to deep dive into that and really crunch the numbers on one property in particular to see how it looks as a short-term rental on Airbnb versus the flip side of having it as a long-term rental. So the property where we're looking at today is one that I own in Manoora. I've had this property for a number of years. It's in a resort-style complex. It's got a beautiful long pool there. It's certainly a very appealing property, both for long-term rentals and obviously for short-term rentals as well. Now, this property does have tenants in it for a little while longer, so we are actually looking at doing another property as an Airbnb. This is a 1-bedroom unit, but I'm not going to use it as the example on this one today, as it was a bit harder to find comparable Airbnb properties to this one. So the numbers were a little bit more vague, where the example I'm using today, there is a real life example up on Airbnb at the moment that we can draw a lot of information from. So the first thing we did is we knew exactly how much this property is currently renting for. So at the moment we can get $400 per week for this property, which works out to be $20,800 a year. So that was quite simple. We know what the long-term rental price is. It's quite easy to calculate the long-term rental of a property, and vacancies are basically near zero in this location. We know if the tenant was to move out, we'd find a new tenant for it tomorrow. So that makes that side of the equation nice and easy. The second challenge was to actually find out how much this property would rent for on Airbnb. So we jumped on. The property sits in Manoora, Queensland. So we brought that up. We left the dates open, left the amount of guests open, just to bring up some good examples. And sure enough, there was this example here that is pretty much the exact property that we've got. It's a different complex, but comparable in pretty much every way. So looking at this property, we're able to see if we were going to stay in it for 1 week, we'll be able to see how much that property would cost. So we just jumped in. Let's go from the 7th to the 24th of October, 1 week, and it comes up $1,865, so $1,865, which is obviously a lot more than $400 a week. That $1,865, what is that? It's like 4 times the weekly rent. So that is very appealing off the get-go and a very positive sign. When we jump into reserve, it gives us a little bit more details in regards to the price. I'll just move my ugly head over. Gives us a little bit more details in the price. We can see that the nightly rent is $205. That they're charging $180 to clean that property, which is quite a high cleaning fee, but they're charging $180. And then the service fee. So that the service fee is essentially Airbnb's commission. So the big figure that we want to focus on here is the $205 per night. Essentially the $180 will pay for a cleaner to come in and clean that property. The service fee we're not seeing, that's commission to Airbnb. But essentially for a week, it's renting for $1,435. So to jump over into our spreadsheet and start looking at the nightly rate. So the nightly rate for this one is $205 per night, which we can see. The big question then becomes, well, what sort of occupancy rate? You're not going to get the 100% occupancy that we are seeing in the long-term market. So what does the short-term occupancy rates look like? And for this, I looked at a couple of things. First and foremost, I rang up a good friend of mine and was like, what sort of occupancy rates can we expect? And she gave me a number, And then I jumped into Airbnb and had a look as well. So if you go into Airbnb, look onto that comparable listing. We can then look at the check-in dates. Once again, I'll move my head and we can start to see some information here. So we can see we're currently in August. We can see the property's pretty much booked out for the majority of August, bar the last week. September, it's pretty much fully booked. October's starting to get booked, and then November's pretty much booked out. So you can start to arrive at a bit of a rough percentage of how many nights a year is it going to be booked out. Jumping back into the spreadsheet, between looking at Airbnb and comparing the numbers on Airbnb, essentially we come to the conclusion that we could expect around a 70% occupancy rate. So what does this look like? So essentially at $205 a night, with a 70% occupancy, means that the property would be rented for 255 nights of the year, bringing a gross income of $52,377. But this doesn't paint the whole picture. There is going to be a few more outgoings with Airbnb. We're essentially going to have to pay for our electricity, as well as they're going to want an internet connection at the property. So that's obviously going to cost money, and these need to be included in the figures. So essentially the electricity, you're going to be looking at about $150 a month, and internet, we know we can get a modem and a setup for about $70 a month. So $1,800 for electricity per annum and $840 for internet, which essentially gives us a net income there of $49,737. So how does that start to compare to the long-term rentals? So essentially, if we were in the long-term pool, we could expect an income of $20,800 per year, where the Airbnb rates are almost double that, which is pretty exciting when you start looking at these numbers. But I think there's a couple of things that are really worth disclosing here. And the first thing is the political side. At the moment, Airbnb is copping a lot of negativity in the political space. There's talk of legislation changes coming in. Down in Byron Bay, they're already limiting the number of nights that you can have your property on Airbnb. So there is some headwinds ahead in this space, and it could have a negative impact. But here in Queensland, we might get another 2, 3, 4 years of being able to run this style of investing before things change. But it's worth pointing out that things are looking a little bit shaky ahead, but how that plays out and how they legislate this space, we'll really have to wait and see. But I think with these sort of returns on offer, it's worth looking at. The second big thing that's worth considering at this point is you're going to need to furnish the property. I'd be looking at putting around $8,000 to $10,000 aside to furnish this particular unit, to have it looking Mickey Mouse, nice and appealing for potential visitors. The third big thing to mention is Airbnb is a lot more hands-on and labor intensive when it comes to managing your properties versus a long-term rental. Long-term rentals, it's a matter of finding a really great tenant, putting them in place, tracking the weekly rents, doing your routine inspections, and overall isn't really that hands-on. Where Airbnb, you need to meet guests, check in guests, take phone calls in the middle of the night, solve any issues on the fly. It is a lot more labor intensive, and because of this, management fees are considerably higher if you're actually looking at paying a property manager to manage your Airbnb compared to a long-term tenant. So I want to take this into account. If we were going to stay hands-off, I want to compare what a long-term tenant management fee would cost, and then obviously your short-term higher rate that an Airbnb manager is going to charge. So looking at this, we can see once again that the Airbnb returns are sitting around $49,000, the long-term tenants sitting around $20,000. Looking at the management fees, Airbnb managers charge around 25%, where a long-term property manager is only charging around 9%. So there's quite a considerable difference. But what does this actually look like at the net? So essentially the Airbnb will still return double what the long-term tenant will. So you're looking at $37,000 versus almost $19,000. So this is still making Airbnb look really, really good, even if you want to be hands-off and let someone else look after it. So looking at this with someone managing it, looking after it, what are the actual real net returns though? At the end of the day, you're still going to have holding costs. You're going to have council rates. If it's in a complex, you're going to have body corporate fees. You're going to be paying interest if you've got a loan against that property. And these holding costs are not going to change, whether it's a long-term property or an Airbnb. Your holding costs are basically going to be the same in that respect. So this is what I really wanted to dig down into. What would the profits be as a long-term rental? And then what's your actual profits as an Airbnb? And I must say, this is where everything started to get very, very exciting, and where my mindset just drastically changed, and I was looking at myself going, why didn't you find this earlier? Why didn't you do the research earlier? But with that said, I'm here today doing the research, and I'm looking forward to setting up our first Airbnb, which I'll absolutely document the journey of that. So if you want to check out that journey, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We speak constantly about money, finances, and property investing, now including Airbnb. So make sure you subscribe. We put out heaps of content. But jumping into this, to look at the actual holding cost of this property, essentially body corporate fees are going to be around $5,000 a year for this property. Your council rates are now sitting at $2,750. And if you were to borrow $200,000 to buy this property, which they are selling around $250,000 in this complex, if you were to borrow $200,000 at a 4.5% interest rate, which we're fortunate we did buy this property a lot cheaper and our interest isn't anywhere near as high because the loan's a lot smaller, you would be paying around $9,000 per year. So the total holding costs for this property would be $16,750. Now, taking that away from the income that you'd receive essentially leaves you with a 10x income when you look at Airbnb versus a long-term. That's right, 10 times the income. As a long-term rental, the property is earning just over $2,000 per year, which isn't really enough to retire off, and not really something I'd class as passive income. It's maybe enough for a weekend away at someone else's Airbnb, but it's certainly not going to make you rich, and you'd really be counting on capital growth to create that financial freedom and rents continuing to climb. We're looking at the Airbnb side of things. An extra $20,000 income after all costs very quickly changes anyone's financial position, especially if you own 2, 3, 4 different properties and start doing this. The income that they can generate is absolutely huge, and that's where, this is with someone else managing it, someone else looking after the property for you. The returns here are staggering, and this is, just blew my mind once I started crunching these numbers, and this is where we're really excited to jump in and open our first Airbnb just to see how this plays out. So, would you consider Airbnb your property? What are the pros and cons? If you've experienced Airbnb, what's been the negatives, what's been the positives? I'd love you to leave a comment below. Certainly it's a really interesting space at the moment. If you have enjoyed this video and you're looking forward to future videos on this topic, make sure you subscribe. We bring out a heap of content on this channel. Otherwise, have a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you soon.